the founder and CEO of Talent Sonar. I am super excited to chat with you all today. We are going to be talking about an issue that I think has been in the news a lot, that there has been a lot of people really interested in discussing, and this is a great opportunity to actually talk to someone who is really an expert in this, has done a lot of work, and can give a perspective that I think will be really enlightening. And so I'm super thrilled to be part of this. So as I mentioned, my name is Laura Mather. There's a picture of me, a little bit of an introduction. I'm a technologist. Believe it or not, I'm a cybersecurity expert. And heck, if there's anything that has culture problems, it's probably cybersecurity. So I've got some experience with dealing with that. This Talent Sonar is actually my second startup. My first was in the cybersecurity space, but I decided to start Talent Sonar to really help address things like culture, really help address hiring and making sure that companies could really be the very best that they could be. And that is something I'm very passionate about. And I believe my guest today, Iris, is also very passionate about that. Iris Bohnet is a professor at Harvard University. Some of you may have heard of that institution. She's a behavioral economist who uses behavioral insights to de-bias the way we live and the way we learn and the way we work, just really help to make our whole world better in many, many ways, which is what makes me so excited to speak with her. She's director of the Women in Public Policy program at Harvard Kennedy School, author of the award-winning book, What Works? Gender Equality by Design, something that I would highly recommend anyone reading who is interested in understanding both the research around what people could do, but even just everyday things that have been shown to help to remove bias in what we are doing. So Iris, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you very much for having me, Laura.
I think this is going to be a great discussion. One thing I do want to mention is we want this to be interactive. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to do it through Twitter. So if you have questions, go onto Twitter. And when you tweet a question, if you can use the hashtag #HireBetter, I've got some colleagues who will be monitoring Twitter and will help to make sure that we can get your questions answered. Don't hesitate to wait till the end. If there's something we're talking about that you have a question or a comment on, that's a really great way to interact with us, and we'd love to take them at the moment those questions come up. So please don't hesitate to do that. In the past few months, there have been many moments of essentially cultural crises that we have seen in the press. Everything from what's been happening at Uber to Fox News to the Google manifesto. I sit right now in Silicon Valley, and I thought maybe the venture capital sexual harassment news was over, and then this week there was another instance of that. And it's unfortunate that this is happening, but at the same time, I think if all of this was going on kind of under the covers, I'm encouraged by the fact that we're starting to address it and that it is coming to light. There's a phrase that sunlight can be the best disinfectant. And so the fact that we're getting some clarity on what is actually happening is it's a good thing, even if it means that we are seeing some negative things that have been happening. So Iris, given your experience in gender diversity and on boards, what are you hearing from organizations about these cultural crises and what people are concerned about?
Well, some panic too, I have to say. I mean, clearly we are at a very special moment right now, and I agree with everything you just said, Laura, that, sunlight is a good thing, and bringing this really to the table, talking about it, and transparency is very, very important. But it's also becoming clear that many of these leaders have no clue and don't know what to do in the moment. And I don't want to suggest that we in the academic community or, in your work with Talent Sonar, which does such amazing work on DBI, helping the DBI's organizations, we have all the answers. But I hope we might bring a bit more kind of system to the question. So I think I typically get three types of questions. So in quieter times, maybe not this week or the past few weeks, it still are the questions that I'm getting still are related to diversity. And when I say diversity, it's just numbers. So we don't have enough women at the top. We don't have a diverse pipeline. We don't have people of color in our workforce, etc. So that's some kind of a first set of questions. And the second one, and that's of course very related to the work that you are doing at Talent Sonar and also to my book What Works, is the question of processes that organizations have heard that maybe data, some of the new technological developments could help them do better in their talent development. And then thirdly, and that's now really very related to our discussion today, is this question of inclusion and more recently also belonging that really has, I think, come to the front of all of our minds over this past 4 or 5 months. Not that we haven't talked about inclusion for quite a while, and particularly in academia, it has been a topic for quite a while. Inclusion saying, this is beyond just numbers, but I think it's not now much more part of the general discussion.
Yeah, I think that it's important that we acknowledge that this is not just a moment in time. This is something that as a society, we need to constantly be making sure we're doing the very best around these things. But I also think in this moment of time, we can take advantage of some resources and maybe some focus and kind of move things forward. And so it's an interesting thing, in Silicon Valley, we have a lot of conversations around culture. I'm using air quotes here that no one can see, but I know other organizations talk about it as well. But is there actually research that shows why it's important to have a healthy culture?
There's actually quite a bit of research that has looked at the very broad question of what I want to call procedural justice. That's how we talk about this. But what procedural justice means is, are people fairly treated in an organization? And what impacts does that treatment have on their behaviors, on their productivity, on turnover rates, other questions? Sometimes that research is also done under the rubric of social contracts, that when we enter an organization, there's of course an explicit contract that we sign, but there's also more of an implicit contract. That's why, social, where I, as an employee, am responding to how Harvard is treating me. And reciprocity, as we all know, is a very important motivator of human behavior. And if I feel that I am undervalued, underpaid, discriminated against, excluded from decision making, etc., that will affect my productivity and also my likelihood of staying or leaving. So that research is actually quite robust and does suggest that culture, particularly, so not culture as in the broad concept, but if we break it down into what it really means, into the behaviors of people, that it really does matter.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me because I do hear so many conversations around culture and how important it is. And yet, even as a CEO, especially the first time I was a CEO, it was really hard for me both to quantify it, to figure out how to drive it. And yet, what you're saying now that I think about it makes so much sense that if we have a culture where people really feel like they can thrive, that's when the company really performs. That's when we're, kind of hitting it on all cylinders and people feel satisfied, which is what I want. That's the way I think my company is going to be successful, is when people feel like they are included, when they feel like their job is really, satisfying to them. And I think a lot of that has to do with culture. And so it's so great that academics have studied this and really understand the implications of getting this right.
Yeah, no, but you're raising kind of an important issue. Interestingly enough, that research has been going on for a number of years, but it's only recently that we link it more to the question of diversity and inclusion that kind of we're talking a bit about today. So I do think this is an interesting moment in time where we're really thinking all about, hold a network of ideas, so to speak, and connecting some of the dots that we might not have connected beforehand.
Yeah, it's funny because, of course, I would wish that we had figured this all out 100 years ago and we wouldn't have to be having this conversation today. But given that we're not, I actually am kind of getting chills right now because I love the fact that we get to be part of this exploration, this discovery. And hopefully everyone who's on this webinar has some appreciation for that we're actually moving kind of human society forward in this moment, and we can all really be part of that. So I'll get off my soapbox now, but I think when people come to you, especially organizations and executives and boards, and they say, "Hey, we really want to be sure we've got a healthy culture, one where our organization can really thrive," do they have ideas of ways they think is really going to help them move that needle?
So very often, and that's actually hard for me to say now because I am in the business of education. What you'll hear me say is kind of undermining my own profession, but I'm going to say it anyway.
We appreciate your candidness here. Thank you.
Yeah, well, data speak for themselves, and I'm a big believer, as you know, in kind of evidence. But anyway, so very often leaders start with training, kind of thinking, can't you come in? Can't you train us to be more inclusive, to have a healthier culture, more respectful of each other? And this is saving grace for me. I'm not saying this is not a good starting point. I mean, clearly everything starts with raising awareness. So yes, I'm all for raising awareness through, training and kind of education. And that is a very good step. But on the other hand, we do have to be cognizant of the work on, for example, diversity training, which is, obviously just one part of culture, but still, I think it is important for us to acknowledge it, in that to date, we really don't have much evidence suggesting that diversity training has worked or has made our organizations more diverse. There is, for example, large correlational analyses by Frank Dobin. He's a professor at the sociology department here at Harvard. And what he's looking at is just a question of, does a company have a diversity training or not, which is a very crude measure, of course, and over many, many years and over many, many companies. And is that related to the diversity of their workforce? And that correlation coefficient is basically zero. And then of course, there are other studies looking at kind of more causal evidence, whether we could actually make people become more inclusive in their thinking with diversity training, and, for example, conducted in schools, and that also has not left us very optimistic. I think the takeaway from that really is that our minds are pretty stubborn beasts. And
definitely mine. I don't know about everybody else's, but certainly mine.
yeah, it's kind of hard to unbias or debias kind of our minds. And so I do think that training has to be coupled with thinking about, what does this mean for my organization, for organizational change on the ground. And if a training does that, then I'm much more optimistic that it can actually promote behavior change in terms of culture and more inclusion.
Yeah, I am a huge advocate of training as long as it's part of a broader program. And even the Caper Institute recently did a study about why people leave technology companies. And one of the findings was that if diversity training is sort of on its own as a standalone, people actually leave more because there's some negative things that can end up happening when you only do that. But at the same time, it's important to raise awareness. And the thing I found when the diversity training is conducted is there becomes a real appetite and a real galvanization of the people who participated in the training to do something beyond the training. And so I think that the training can be this awesome jumping off point of now we understand what the issues are, let's do something. And I think if organizations can really take advantage of that moment, they can have huge impact and less change management, to be honest, because suddenly you have this energy around making maybe some process changes and stuff, and then people are excited to do that instead of it's just being forced on them for a reason they don't understand.
I completely agree, Laura. I quickly have to jump in here just to explain maybe why, diversity training can lead to the kind of backlash that you just described. So generally, I think we can have three possible effects, right? We could have just nothing, and there's a lot of evidence on the nothing as well, where diversity training just has been checking the box, and it didn't change much, but it also didn't have any negative effects. I think the scarier part is what you just described, that it could also lead to something that we call licensing. And that is, it licenses basically my bad behavior because I've just basically taken the medicine and now I've done my work, or I've just worked out, so to speak, and now I can have the dessert because I've just worked out. And that's kind of what people have been finding, kind of on the darker side of diversity training impact, that it can lead to those licensing effects that I've just now done the training, so therefore now I don't have to worry about this anymore. But as you said, on the brighter side, I think we're completely aligned. If we can combine it with something more structural in the company, and if it's galvanizing kind of enthusiasm and appetite for that, then it's of course a great thing.
Exactly. It's interesting. I don't have research on this, but I've talked to some people who have come out of the diversity training, and their comment to me was, well, now I'm only going to hire out of Harvard and MIT and Stanford because at least I know I'm getting the best of the best and I know I'm not discriminating. And I thought, oh my gosh, right? They were so worried about the discrimination following the training that they actually fell back on bad behaviors. So again, no research around that, but just something I've heard anecdotally. And so these are things that we can't understand oftentimes uh, the impact or the negative consequences that some of these things have, even on the edge cases. And it's why it's important, I think, to be sure that we are trying to put things in place to alleviate some of those things that might come up.
Yeah, no, that's great.
And so given all the research that you have done and that a lot of colleagues in the space have done, are there things that can be used to address culture? I mean, it sounds like training might be part of an overall program, but if there is an overall program, are there other components that have been shown to be effective to help address and help to create really healthy cultures?
Well, first of all, thank you for showing Harvard. I'm feeling right at home here on our.
Of course. And only the best of the best are in that picture, so I'm just kidding.
Yeah, but yeah, so let me actually maybe unpack that a little bit, because, and I'm actually drawing on a literature review that a team member of mine, Siri Otila, just did on inclusion, because inclusion obviously very related to culture, but one important part of culture is also similarly kind of, I don't know, somewhat diffuse concept. And we were really trying to understand what are the correlates, what are the kind of factors that have been shown to be related to people's kind of, happy experiences at work, so to speak. And so I'm just going to take a moment here, maybe share kind of the 5 buckets that we have come up with and that we've put them in. A first one is something that we've touched upon a little bit, and that is process. So people do care about fair treatment, and they will respond by, leaving or sabotaging the organization, or just not giving it their very best in their performance. So I do think we might have to come back to process. It is an important part of the equation. Process also matters because it's an observable characteristic of an organization, right? So culture is a bit diffuse, and sometimes, I mean, it's our experiences, obviously, but it turns out that people take kind of, signs, kind of look for signposts in an organization that might give them some indication on how inclusive this organization is. And fair hiring, fair promotion processes, fair performance appraisals, transparency, these kinds of things, pay equity. These are kind of proxies, so to speak, for an inclusive culture. So I think that's the first one, so it's process. And the second one is outcome. So you can't have a happy culture if you don't walk the talk. This is not just about me feeling good and kind of happy about where I am, but that happiness is related to numbers, and numbers come in different shapes and form. Can be my pay, can be actual kind of diversity numbers, other people like me in this organization. So I think that's important for us to know. That's why sometimes we would say, diversity is not really going to work without inclusion, and inclusion is really not going to work without diversity either. So you kind of need the culture, and you also need the numbers. And then thirdly, you also need to think about behaviors. And so that's beyond process and beyond just outcomes, but that is very related to my daily experiences at work. And sometimes we even refer to them as micro behaviors, kind of the small things. Do people say hello? Do people say thank you? Am I the victim of micro inequities or microaggressions where I'm interrupted, not given voice in meetings, and not being included in kind of decision-making processes? So behavior is a third one that's important for us. A fourth one, and I just have two more, a fourth and a fifth one, so I won't go on forever, but I think it's helpful, actually, that list. And the fourth one is power. So I just referred to decision-making, and that actually goes back to the literature that I mentioned before on procedural justice. People care about voice. So people typically understand hierarchy. So they understand that not everyone can have the final say. But people, given their position and given their understanding of their relative power in an organization, love to be heard. Whether that's in team meetings, whether that's in consulting projects, in my world, joint papers, publications. So I think that's an important one as well. And then finally is a concept that we didn't quite find the right word for, and so I'm going to offer you two. One, we could just call it belonging, or we could also say wholeness. But what we mean with that is, Siri and I, is this question of, can I bring my whole self to work? Or do I have, as some researchers have called it, do I have to cover? Kind of constantly dress differently, or kind of other types of behaviors, or not share, the kind of hobbies I have because it's just not the norm or the standard, etc. So I think these are 5 buckets of things. Again, it's process, it's outcome, it's behavior, it's power, and it is belonging. And they all, I think, are important for a healthy, inclusive culture.
And a question I have on that is, it seems to me some of those are kind of more quantitative than others. Process, you can sort of measure, you can at least say you're doing some things or not. Something like behavior, I'm wondering if my belief is, and I'd love your opinion on this, if you create essentially an inclusive culture where there is some diversity, where there is, people feel like everyone is respected, I think a lot of the bad behaviors might be mitigated because people might feel like they shouldn't behave badly because the culture doesn't support that. Is there any research on that, or do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So normally when we work with an organization on their culture, we start out with more of a qualitative, and I'm actually going to get to the quantitative in just a moment, more of a qualitative diagnostic, I want to call it, just to understand what's going on. What are the exclusion experiences? I mean, we're learning also that exclusion is not the same for everyone. I mean, there's so many different traditionally disadvantaged groups in our society that the what might feel very inclusive for one group might actually feel quite exclusive for another. So that's important to have those discussions. And then we typically do quite literally an inclusion diagnostic that is a survey. And the difference, I think, to the ways we have been trying to capture culture in the past, where often we used, for example, work satisfaction surveys where we asked how people feel. In our surveys, we focus much more on what people do and what they observe others doing. So
Mm.
we're really trying to get at behaviors, and we're trying to measure. These include questions of, how often have you seen someone being interrupted this past week or this past month? How often have you been interrupted? Often the first question is more diagnostic than the second question because people tend to be even more biased about themselves, with lots of recollection biases, but also maybe not acknowledging that they themselves are victims of bias. So it's sometimes more that actually gives us more information when we ask them about what they see happening in the organization. So we do this inclusion diagnostic, and then thirdly, and that really gets to your point, then we have to start thinking about the norms, right? Then you have to, again, do what we talked about before when we want to translate diversity training into action. And we also have to kind of bridge this intention action gap, we sometimes call it. So now that we have a diagnostic, we have to do a third step where we ask the organization basically to define who they would like to be. I read an article yesterday in Financial Times on Frances Fry, a colleague of mine who was at the business school, who's now at Uber, kind of working on these questions, kind of changing the name of a room that was previously called the war room to the peace room. You're signaling something to your employees with using that word. Now, again, you need to talk the walk. You walk the talk. You also need to talk the walk, actually, with the words peace. But you also need to walk the talk. So it's of course not enough with the peace room, but very much you have to become something like, we sometimes refer to this as norm entrepreneurs, right? Where you establish kind of what the new aspiration is of what kind of a culture, what kind of environment we want to have, where again, people can bring their whole self. I'm actually going to read the definition to you that might be helpful, that I just found from Sherbin and Rashid. This is totally new, 2017, where they define the traits of kind of inclusive leadership, which I think might be helpful, kind of to talk about the positive. So ensuring that team members speak up and are heard, making it safe to propose novel ideas, empowering team members to make decisions, taking advice and implementing feedback, giving actionable feedback to employees, and sharing credit for team success. So I think we kind of know what the ingredients are of kind of a healthy culture, and they're probably along those traits that I just described to you. And then the question is, how can we make them actionable? And I'm not just kidding with the peace room. Things like that matter. The portraits on our walls matter on what we communicate about what kind of organization we are, how inclusive we are, whether this is a place where somebody like you, me, others can feel at home. And then we really have to then it gets pretty into the nitty gritty parts of, so how do you run a meeting? Do you speak first? Or do you have others speak first? How much speaking time, let's say you are the team leader, do you take up? Is that like most of the time you talk, or most of the time others talk? And it can even get into body language. Again, it sounds, going back to your quantitative question, a bit soft, but again, you can observe and kind of just give feedback on how these things go. And then kind of one organization pursued a quite creative approach. In fact, kind of totally understanding exactly what I'm talking about now. The remaining question for them was really, so how do we bridge this intention action gap? Kind of we bought in, we kind of have our list. So we did the diagnostic, then we now have a list of the things that we want to see happen. How do we make them happen? And they introduced little red flags. And they now have little red flags, boxes of little red flags on their conference tables. And people come to the meeting and pick up a red flag and then raise the red flag whenever a transgression occurs. Now, that might seem heavy-handed to some, maybe not heavy-handed enough to others. And it's not research. I just observed one of the meetings. But what it did was it didn't criminalize transgressions. And people were like, oh, my God, that's not what I meant. And, the transgressions actually were ranged from small things, such as always referring to an engineer as him, so just using the masculine form, to, bad things, such as racist jokes. And worse, but that didn't happen in the meeting. But so it did not criminalize transgressions, but also it did not raise the bar for people who wanted to raise the red flag so high that nobody dared. It also made it completely clear and transparent that raising the red flag was the thing to do and the norm, and there wouldn't be retaliation. In fact, retaliation was punished very, very badly. And the third thing it did, which I didn't anticipate, was it brought humor to the meeting quite a bit. I was like, oh my God, I have no idea I'm doing this. And I thought that was actually a good thing. Again, this is not, a serious evaluation on my part, but just my observation. I'm raising the red flag here just as, not as a literal, I don't think we all need red flags now, but literal, but more as a metaphor for people to think about, what is my red flag? What would it help? What would it take for us? So first to diagnose, of course, but then secondly, to translate who we ideally want to be into actual behaviors. And we need help. We need commitment devices, and we need these signposts, these signals, and even the signs on our door to be able to do that.
You brought up something earlier where you talked about how intention doesn't often match action, or there are times when intention is different from action. And I think the red flag example is perfect for that, because I think people would raise the red flag and probably someone would say, holy cow, it was not my intention at all to be offensive, and I didn't even realize I was doing it. But it gives the opportunity to, one, realize it, and two, correct for it, and also to show that the intention was not negative. So I can see a real advantage to that.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right.
Awesome. So hopefully everyone who's listening is enjoying this. We're going to continue the conversation, but if you have questions, I would really love for you to post them on Twitter. Use the hashtag HireBetter, and we will get to them as they come up. So please do not hesitate to do that. So, in hiring, and I use a lot of the research that's in your book. I didn't do any of this research. I just am standing on the shoulders of giants and trying to make that research easy for these organizations to implement. It's very clear that changing process can be the thing that changes hiring outcomes. Having training ahead of that can often help, but it's been shown that making those process changes are the things that are what can create the outcomes that people are looking for. And so with culture, do you have thoughts on process change in particular that can positively impact the culture of an organization?
Yeah. So first of all, I have to disagree with you, Laura. You are not standing on the shoulders of giants. It's amazing that you do at Talent Sonar. I mean, you can't stand on people's shoulders. I think that's a good thing to do, but it's giant work that you're doing. So, so I want to talk about that in just a moment, kind of get to some of the things that you're doing that we think is really important. But maybe let me take a kind of bigger perspective on process for a moment, and actually, start where we just left off with the teams as well. because I think process, sometimes people just think, oh, this is formal process, and it is formal process. So some of this is very formal, and that's where what we want to get. And I think that's where your work has been so important in terms of formalizing actually the hiring process. But process, is not always quite that formal. So there's quite a bit of research on how to make teams perform better. And it's actually a very long tradition of that work as well. And one of the big challenges that teams often are confronted with is called groupthink, where we as a group do not actually outperform the kind of individual components of our group, and sometimes underperform. And that groupthink actually would say we underperform. And why? And most people are probably familiar with this concept, but maybe let me just give you kind of an example of why that might be working that way. And that is that if I asked you, I don't know, to guess how many people live in Mexico City, you all would write down a number, and you now, tweet it, send it to Laura. You don't actually have to do it, but and we would then, take the average. And so that's one way for us to kind of get your thoughts. Another way for us to do this exercise would be for us to now, which of course you can't actually speak with us, but for you to speak with us and say, I think 20 million, others might say 25, others might say 15 or 30, whatever it might be. And it turns out that that's really early research that happened in the 60s already, showed that under many conditions, the first mechanism actually outperforms the second mechanisms, because we really get many independent views when we collect the information in a decentralized way. And when we do it as a group, the groupthink can emerge where we defer to maybe the person who spoke first because he or she put an anchor in the ground, or we defer to somebody who we know, may come from Mexico or might have some other experience, might be more, quantitative scientist, whatever it might be. And we're not really putting all our thinking to the task. So they have come up with a number of procedural interventions to overcome groupthink. And one of them, and that's, I think, actually pretty intuitive to imagine that could work, is to establish devil's advocacy in the group. And it's important that it's not always the same person. Could also be, ideally, could even be a sub-team, which plays that role. And the role of that team or of that person for that meeting, exclusively, basically, is to tell everyone else why they're wrong. And it turns out that increases team performance, the accuracy, the performance of teams. That's also a process. And that's also a process that I like, and when we think about inclusive cultures, because it's a little related to the red flag before, in that it gives us permission to point out when not every voice is heard, when we're just running in one direction, when we're not really benefiting from the diversity in the team, something we sometimes refer to as collective intelligence. So that's also a process. So I just wanted to give this as one example. It doesn't have to always be, written in stone, kind of very formal. But if I may, let me also move to some of the more formal parts, because as I said at the very beginning, it is absolutely true that we care about fair treatment. And fair treatment often starts with our hiring experience in an organization. And that can include, pay negotiations, can include the interview process, can include onboarding processes. So lots of procedures there, which tell me something about what kind of organization is this? Is this an organization which, cares about me for my whole self, which gives me a fair shot, which provides an equal playing field? And, takes some of the subjectivity. This is the kind of process which takes some of the subjectivity out of the evaluation process. So yes, hiring, evaluation, and including job advertisements, are really important in telling me something about the culture and being signposts for the culture, and also infecting the kind of person I think I can be in this environment.
Yeah, it's a big part of what my excuse me, my mission and my vision has been is that I believe that if, I my software specifically impacts hiring, but I believe that if the employees at an organization see that it is critical for that organization to be sure that the people who are hired are the very best people for the role, regardless of race or gender or what sports team they follow or, any of these other things that come up, then I have some increased level of confidence that I'm going to be included in this organization, that I'm going to be valued, especially if I'm in some kind of underrepresented minority, which may even be that I follow a different sports team than everyone else. So I think that what you're saying is that by implementing some of these processes, it can help people feel like the organization, it's actually helping the organization to walk the talk, as you said before, because they're saying not only do we say we value these things, but we're going to make sure in our hiring process or maybe in our promotion process or in our performance evaluation process that the best outcome for everyone is happening, and that can influence culture.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I mean, I have to add one more to your list, Laura. I mean, all of those are very important: hiring, performance appraisals, and promotion processes. But I kind of knew about this, but recently working with a law firm it was really brought home to me in that, of course, performance appraisal or promotions, don't start with the moment when they happen, but sometimes start in your very first year, where some people are just given amazing opportunities to shine and participate in cool deals and get enormous feedback. And, when we looked at how this happens, it's a very informal process where, partners select the first year associates they want to work with, and the first year's associates, no big surprise, are very likely to look like the partner. And that then, of course, leads to this vicious cycle where you're not given opportunities in the first year and the second, and then you don't have a big file kind of to show. And by year 8, when you're up for promotion, you just have something that I recently called in an article this thin file, where you just haven't been in many deals and you also haven't gotten a lot of feedback. So I do think, I mean, it's known as performance support bias. And even there, more formal processes, that's in fact what the law firm is working towards, more formal processes of work allocation, where somebody actually keeps track that we not only say we are a merit-based culture, but we in fact are a merit-based culture where everyone is going to be judged on their merit. But merit means being given the opportunities to in fact succeed.
Exactly, because of course what happens is when it comes time for the promotion, they do say it's merit-based. You didn't have, an assignment overseas, so we're not going to promote you, where Fred did. And then they say it's merit-based, but it actually was at the time of the assignment overseas that it was not merit-based, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing again, sort of the dimensions that these things undertake, and people really believe they're doing good things and they have good intentions, but they don't realize that a lot of times the inequity started all the way back from the first day of work or even during the hiring decision.
Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah, I mean, I see where you're like summarizing. So let me hold my question because you might have
No,
some
no, go for
from
it.
the
No,
audience. No, I mean, I was just
okay.
wondering how you think the market is responding to what we're just describing, to kind of I mean, what you brought to the hiring process is really more rigor. And is that resonating with the organizations that you work with?
Yeah, it's been interesting actually. Maybe this is a good place for the summary, but I would say 2 years ago, um, when I would talk to organizations, a lot of times they would say, "Oh, what you do, you're trying to remove unconscious bias from the hiring process, you need to talk to our chief diversity officer. And of course, the chief diversity officer did not control how hiring was done. I think they
Mhm.
wanted to, but that was usually not in their purview. We did make some traction at that time with organizations that realized that when a hiring decision was made, the person making the decision was often relying on how similar the candidate was to them. And that was very frustrating to recruiters because they would end up, the hiring decision would get made based on things that didn't seem actually relevant to the job. You know, they might choose Fred over Mary, but Fred actually didn't have the same skills, but they would say they would quote unquote like Fred better. And for a recruiter, I think that's really frustrating when they're trying to create a repeatable process and deliver to the hiring teams candidates that are going to fit certain criteria. And it's really hard to determine what someone's going to quote unquote like when it's not at all quantified. And so we definitely had organizations that really wanted to be sure that the decisions were based on things like skills. And then on culture, we rely on the research that shows that as the candidate aligns with the corporation's values, that often can be a predictor of whether or not they'll fit the culture. But what we're seeing now actually is the fact that one, I think people are realizing maybe because of this recent crisis around culture. I think the recent crisis around culture has really been around diversity, right? You've got the sexual harassment things, you've got the inequities in the tech companies, you've got the manifestos that come out that claim things that are false. And it's now this diversity culture issue, whereas before it might have been how hard people worked or, whether or not they were willing to sign up for certain assignments or whatever. And now it is really, can we make sure our culture is one where everyone feels included? And so the shift we're seeing is that organizations are now tasking talent acquisition with making sure that the hiring decisions are equitable and are based on the things that are relevant. And I think the premise is that if one component of improving the culture is to get better representation of lots of different types of people. And when you have that, I think you have less echo chamber effect. You have, in a lot of ways, less groupthink. It can be maybe easier to get some naysayers because you actually have people who have a different perspective than the majority group, and those people might be willing to express their perspective. So I think we're seeing that there's been this realization that if we can hire a diverse set of people, we may be able to impact our culture.
Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah, I'm seeing something very similar. I think many organizations, private and public sector really, are taking a much more structural approach to the question of diversity and inclusion, and that's very, very encouraging. I'm seeing it, I see what you're seeing, that it becomes a core HR function, but I'm also seeing it move into businesses, where the businesses kind of take it up themselves and kind of review questions that I really haven't seen being reviewed before without the chief diversity officer basically asking or the question or making them do that. I'm seeing much more from the businesses now, and I think that's also very encouraging, suggesting that the businesses increasingly believe in the business case, and also believe that a fair and diverse and inclusive workplace is better for the employees and better for the business.
Yeah, it's really interesting that, you and I know all the different research around the business case for diversity. The thing that has resonated with businesses that I talk to the most is that they need to broaden the market that they're selling into. And to do that, they need representation from that market, whether it's women, whether it's people who didn't go to Harvard. It can be a multi-dimensional thing, but if they can bring people into their organization that look like a new market segment for them, they feel like that is going to make them more successful, which I think research has shown is actually true. But that has been the business case that has really helped people feel like they're getting, they're justifying making these changes.
Yeah.
So I do want to again ask people. I think we are getting some questions on Twitter, which is fantastic. And so if you, they may be actually direct messages to us, but you can do that, or just use the Hire Better Twitter hashtag, because we would love to take your questions. Um, so right now I think we'll go into Q&A. So here's one of the questions that came in. One theory is that culture is top down. In the example of Uber, the board seemed to think that firing the CEO would improve the culture. Actually, I saw that Sheryl Sandberg pointed that out too. She said, you know, any leader can change the organization's culture. What do you think about that?
Hmm. I think that's a very interesting observation. I think Uber does more though. Again, I just know a little bit because Frances Fry, my colleague, just went there earlier this summer. But so I think they are trying to do more than just replacing the CEO. But I would strongly argue tone from the top is important, no question. So tone from the top is important, but you cannot change a culture by just changing the leader. I mean, generally, honestly, for me, leadership is what leaders do. I mean, they have to walk the talk, and it could well be that a new leader brings in new thinking around processes, around all the topics that we've talked about today. So I don't want to exclude that possibility, but I think that is what a leader can do, and then it has to be an inclusive process that again includes questions of what signs do you have on your door and how are teams being led. In fact, sometimes I recently just learned this term. Researchers referred to something that is called the frozen middle. I hadn't even heard that before, but I have experienced it. That we sometimes experience quite a bit of commitment from the C-suite for a number of reasons. I mean, also because the C-suite often has to pay the price for bad behaviors or non-inclusive work environments, as we're just describing. And therefore kind of sees the reputational gains for the organization, also thinks more about kind of the markets that the company might want to go into. So everything that you just said, Laura. But, and that's actually important for us to know, might not have to do all of the hard work that the so-called frozen middle has to do. And I think that's also kind of an important message. We're not saying that an inclusive culture is simple. Living inclusion and belonging and really creating an environment where everyone can thrive is not just something we do, in our spare time. But this is hard work. And I think we collectively, and I'm now thinking we researchers, or I as well, have to think harder about middle management as well. What do their lives look like? I mean, they all probably have 368 things to worry about already. What will make their lives better, and how could we combine that betterment with going to working towards a better culture?
Yeah, no, that is definitely what we see. You know, I've definitely had cases where the board has gone to the head of talent acquisition and said, we really want you to implement Talent Sonar. And the head of talent acquisition is saying, look, I'm just so overwhelmed that I don't think this is a priority, which really surprised me given the board said it was a priority. But I think that gets to your frozen middle, and also to making sure that it's clear to everyone in the company what the priorities are. Because the thing that we definitely are seeing is that there's kind of a trade-off. People think there's a trade-off between time to hire and getting quality in. And I think talent acquisition often feels like time to hire is the most important thing. And that just says to me that it's not being communicated from executives, that quality of hire and getting a diverse and inclusive group of people into the organization is a priority. So I think that's something that these executives can do.
Yeah, no.
One last question. So somebody mentioned that their workplace satisfaction surveys always place them at the top of the best places to work. That's congratulations to you, whoever you are. And the employees seem happy. And yet this person knows that the corporate culture needs improving. Are there ways other than employee satisfaction surveys to measure how culture is doing and what could be improved?
Hmm. Yeah, it's a very good question. So I would strongly urge organizations to get at behavioral diagnostics and not so much ask people how they feel. Um, so try to get at as closely as you possibly can to the kind of behaviors that you would want to see being espoused in the organization, and whether that is, voice in meetings, respect. What does that mean if we, talk about respect? Um, Access to mentoring, to development opportunities. So try to be as specific, I think, as you possibly can. And generally, there's a behavioral scientist perspective. We believe that that's closer to people's actual experiences than when you ask me generic questions on, how inclusive is this workplace? I think that's a very, very hard question. If you ask me this question about Harvard, that's a very hard question in kind of the aggregate to respond to.
Yeah, no, that's a really great point. Well, just in summary, I hope everyone on the webinar has heard, there seems to be this moment in time that we are all experiencing where organizations want to make sure that their cultures are as healthy and productive as they can be. And the great news, in my opinion, is there is research that shows how to do this. And it goes beyond training, which tends to be kind of the default thing people say, maybe if I just do this 1 hour class, everyone will behave better. That can be a good start, but should not be your entire journey. And that there are some process things that can happen. And specifically, if you want to start to, uh, you know, create culture of equity and where people feel like everyone is valued, one place to do that is in hiring and helping people to be sure that the hiring decisions that are made are based on what's relevant and not on things that can merely indicate similarity to whoever's doing the hiring. We have a white paper. We'll be sending that out to everyone who participated. In case you're interested in seeing that, you're welcome to send us an email at info@talentsonar.com. We'd love to talk to you if this is something that you think could be of interest to your organization. And Iris, I just want to thank you so much. I love having these conversations with you, and I think it can be a real benefit that you and I can have this conversation and let other people kind of participate and hear what we're talking about. So thank you for the work you're doing, and thank you for spending this hour with us.
Thank you very much for having me, Laura. It's been a great pleasure.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.